Welcome once again. Now we continue with the first panel discussion of today after the, I think, actually, I dare say, very positive speech by Frank Moss, which I would dare say is not actually half full, but more than 2/3 full. But that is my opinion. Of course, as a central banker, he's extra careful. And please let me welcome everybody now for our first panel discussion. I'll take a seat for that. And let me introduce our speakers in a minute, but first let me introduce the topic that we want to talk about. Since we have this very international audience, we thought this year we should actually take a panel discussion that tries to bring in all the experiences from around the world. And Frank actually just mentioned in his speech that there are crisis experiences, of course, from various regions, from Asia in the 80s, from Latin America, and now from Central and Eastern Europe. So he already, I don't know if knowingly or not, scratched upon what we want to talk about here on our panel. The topic of our panel is boom and bust lessons from various world regions. And the overarching questions for that was, looking at the world, you always have crisis episodes coming up. And there are certainly lessons that CFOs, but also bankers, learn from those experiences. And at the same time, every crisis might be different, but there might be also some similarities. So we thought we'd try to bring this very distinctly international panel together. And I would like to introduce, starting on my left here, with Dr. Andrea Karls. He's the CEO of the Central and Eastern European Holding of Commerzbank AG, and also a regular speaker at our conferences. So I'm very happy that he's made it again this year to join us, this time in Warsaw. Welcome, Mr. Karls. Then Andrea Pahl, she's the CFO of Northern Capital Gateway, which other people might just know as St. Petersburg Airport. She's also a very experienced financial executive, has been working in Bulgaria before, was in Frankfurt as well, or was it just
most of the time?
Yeah, most of the time indeed, and is now for quite some time at St. Petersburg and managed a big expansion financing program there, partly with the help of IFC. And you've so far been a guest at our conferences. I'm very happy that you've been accepted our invitation as a speaker this year. So welcome Andrea. We have on my right, on your left, Fernando Liceaga. He's Administration and Finance Director of Tetra in Mexico. So a Latin American with a regional role. Tetra Mexico is one of the largest Tetra subsidiaries or parts of the Tetra group in the world, if I remember correctly, I think.
That is right.
And you're also a very experienced executive, especially in the, we talked in our preparation about how the recent crisis affected Mexico. Not so much, you said, those times back in the 80s, they're long past, so it's very interesting to see now what your experiences from then, or how you think the world has changed, or Mexico has changed compared to then. And we have Conchita Manabat. She's a member of the IAFEI Advisory Council and the Chairperson of Manabat and Company. She's from the Philippines, and her CV is quite simply too long to present verbally here, so please look at your program brochures. I think it's a little bit more elaborate there. So we have a whole range of experts, and we will also have a video message. This is a first time for me as well. I hope technically it will all work. By Erik Nielsen, the chief economist from UniCredit Group. We will try to merge this in later on in the discussion. So welcome everyone, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I would actually like to start with you, Conchita, because you're the furthest away. And your experiences is also in terms of the timing stretches back probably the longest. And in our preparation, we talked a lot about the 80s when you were a CFO in the Philippines before starting your own advisory company. So I really want to go back all the way back there, because many people think the Asian crisis as a as a symbolic, a very typical financial crisis. When you think about the way you run your company back then in the 80s, what were the early signs already at the time when everything seemed to go smoothly, where you could tell there's a crisis in the making? And looking back, how would you probably run your company, or how would you recommend CFOs running their companies differently than what you probably did, or what your colleagues did? I'm sure you did everything right.
Yes. Probably it's good to mention what happened in the 80s, or what were the antecedents. If you would recall, there was the oil price spikes from below 20, it went to 40,
Yeah.
right? The Philippines is not an oil-producing country. Okay, so companies that are, so to speak, wanting in terms of financing, we have the allocation of capital in the country at the time was not very developed. And so euro or petrodollars became the king, so to speak. Everybody would like to avail of it. And it is foreign currency denominated.
Yeah.
All right, so most companies availed of this. All right, and companies were highly levered. Okay, with that, interest rates also went up. Okay, and so companies that are, whose revenues are derived in the local currency, and then you have to pay your loans in foreign currency, and then there was the subsequent devaluation of the local currency, you are in a fix.
Yeah.
Everybody was in a fix. So what do? Okay, at that time in Asia, the buzzwords were conservation, okay, and right-sizing.
Yes.
Okay, but right-sizing is a very kind word.
And we hear that a lot these days again,
Yes,
I must say.
companies, we saw companies closing down, employees being sent on furlough, on a false hope that things will be better. All right, and then subsequently companies closed. All right, there is this sense of denial that you are in trouble.
Okay.
Okay, so I would say from that perspective, the lesson that I can say can be learned is that don't fall in love with your project or your company.
Or with your foreign currency.
Yes. When you see the signs, you should know when to exit.
Okay.
All right? If you prolong the agony, hoping that things will be better, you will be in bigger trouble.
Well, thanks. Fernando, as I just said, you said Mexican companies these days, and especially macro politics, macroeconomics, are very different than from back in the peso crisis. What are your main, your key elements that you say that Mexico is now more solidly than in the past?
Well, I believe there are two things that the Mexican government have done very, very good. The first of it, and both of them happened, let's say, in the mid-90s. The first one was an attitude towards a free trade. Nowadays, Mexico is the country with most free trade agreements signed in the world. And that has placed Mexico in a very competitive situation, which could be better if it weren't for let's say, some reforms that the country has not passed, the Congress has not passed yet. But that has definitely placed our country in a very competitive situation. The other one that was very, very positive was the autonomy of the central bank, which Mexico in the late 80s was a hyperinflationary economy, and in the mid 90s, the central bank became autonomous, and of course, with that, the main mandate to the central bank was to put, let's say, stability to the purchasing power of the Mexican currency. So that came later on with a free-floating band for the Mexican peso, and that allow, I would say, a lot of the variables, macroeconomic variables, to be stable from that period on.
But introducing free trade agreements, I'm sure, first of all, is a pain for many companies. I mean, you give up your protected environment. So
absolutely.
I'm sure that was not welcomed with great enthusiasm by many. Or was there a sense of urgency that people understood this is the way forward?
Yeah, well, but in the end, the protectionism that the government gives to the companies, in the end, it will only play against you, because you will have let's say, a shielded economy, and you will not translate benefits to the consumers, which in the end will make your company grow.
Yeah.
So that is something that it gives competitiveness not to the companies but to the country as a whole.
Okay. And you would say that, but logically then companies benefit from that. I mean, if your country as a whole.
In the long run, of course.
Now, you're with Tetra Pak as a foreign investor. Has that changed? Do you feel that foreign investment has been made easier as well during that time?
What kind of investment again?
You're an FDI basically. Tetra Pak is not a Mexican company.
No.
And has FDI been more attracted to the country as well?
Yeah, well, not precisely to Tetra Pak. Tetra Pak is a family-owned company. So in terms of what I have seen of other companies is that they are more attracted, they have more appetite to come to Latin American companies, for example, Mexico, in the terms that they find a better places to put their business in, not only with regards to free trade agreements, but also, labor force is very cheap in our country. So there's certain other competitive elements that benefit countries like Mexico.
Okay. Mr. Karls, you're the banker in this round. So you look at a lot of different economies, countries. What, in your perspective, is at the moment the big challenge that countries, especially since you're from the CE holding, especially in this region, but also in others?
First of all, I'm quite jealous looking at you both, especially. I don't know how the weather in St. Petersburg is, but I assume in your region it's much better than it is just currently here. Yeah? So,
you don't want to be in the Philippines during monsoon, I guess.
Well, that's probably true, but
Yes.
but nevertheless, but I think it's great to have such an international panel of so interesting speakers. I personally think that the biggest challenge and also the biggest change over the last couple of years is somehow the uncertainty about developments in the world, and also its interdependencies between the different regions. For example, we are representing here on the panel, and you see this, for example, with the discussion about the US deficit and budget, and you see this with the discussions around the euro, you see this with Syria, etc., etc. So I think this overall development in the world influencing the different markets obviously is an issue. And is a threat, but obviously it brings also opportunities to different markets. And I think you have to cope with that, and you can't rely on some sort of stable environment because there is none. Yeah, it's always changing, and from my perspective, I think it's changing faster and faster. And that's also true for the CE region. If you look at different markets there, yeah, you can't treat the CE region as one region, and we heard this morning as well. It's different markets. I'm pretty sure we come especially to this market where we are sitting here right today, to the Polish market in more detail in the discussion. And then you see there are completely different markets like I don't know, Ukraine or Russia, yeah, where you are definitely the expert for, and you have to cope in all these markets with different environments, with different issues, and I think that is the issue. On the other hand, I think the positive thing, what we heard already this morning, is the growth rates. Yeah, we saw and we see more or less double growth rates compared to the core EU or Eurozone. Yeah, and that obviously is of attractiveness for many companies. And when you discuss in these days, for example, with the German Mittelstand, their ambitions and what they are looking at internationalization to Central Eastern Europe, but also to Asia, to North America. So I think this will continue.
But you just mentioned a heightened volatility, and I find it interesting that, Andrea, you mentioned something very similar when it comes to the way how emerging economies, especially how the economic development in those countries is, with where you said you have large upswings and downswings. Can you elaborate a little bit for our audience as well on your experience that you had there in this respect, especially as a CFO of an airport on the one hand in Bulgaria, but now also in Russia?
Well, of course, I can just talk about what's happening in the airport industry, because this is what I'm in since 12 years. And of course, I entered into this industry coming from another infrastructure part, which is power supply. And I had to learn. It's a different industry, also infrastructure, but a different kind of pattern. And of course, my first years have been in Frankfurt, with Frankfurt Airport, and we learned that the good years are when you have a traffic increase of 4 to 5%. The bad years are when you have a drop of -2 and so on. And what we are experiencing in other countries, because Fraport has an expansion strategy, and we started with Lima, Peru, and then we went to India and to China and to Bulgaria and finally to Russia. And we see there that in cases of crisis, the drops are not -2, -3, the drops are -26. And then the growth rates are like we experience now in St. Petersburg since 2010, double digit every year. We will finish our 1.2 billion project in hopefully 6 weeks' time. And actually, we need already to start the next one because the capacity is not enough. And this is not what's happening, let's say, in Western Europe, where everybody is happy about 1.5% growth.
And then you have a particular problem, I guess, as an airport. You invest a lot in very long-term, very fixed assets.
Right. So
that must be
we are very
tough to find a bank to do that, huh?
Well, we found banks, and we are going to look for others very soon for the next phase of development. Yes, this industry is very heavy, so we have 60% of our costs are personnel, and it's very difficult to cope with drops. So in cases of crisis, until we manage to decrease a little bit our costs, actually the growth starts again. And on the other hand, we have to invest well in time in infrastructure, big amounts of money, and well, it is a question of, at the end, of luck, development of the world economy, if you get the passengers or not, if you can actually see a return or not.
Yeah.
So.
But would you say, don't you find long trends, despite the extreme swings of -26, +14, whatever, can you still say we can still have a baseline projection for a long trend, or does that not help you because your capacity just can't keep up in the short run?
I mean, the airport industry is one of the favorite of the banks when they're about to give project finance, because it's until now very, very predictable. So in average, you have 4 to 6% growth. So you have drops, you have peaks, but in average, it grows permanently. And it's much, let's say, comfortable to invest in airports than in roads, for example, because there are alternatives. You can take another road, not especially the one where you have to pay a toll, but with the airport is different. And since people, I mean, the whole world is really traveling very much, and travel, it's a commodity in the meantime, the industry is quite safe in terms of long-term development. But as a CFO, you have to deal with the challenges of the day and of the year, and this is sometimes not easy.
Okay. Thanks, and thank you, everyone. I would like to take this situation now to have a little bit of an economist talking to us, which, as I said, is Erik Nielsen from UniCredit Bank, who cannot be with us today, but he prepared a little message for 3 questions that we've sent him in advance. So let's see what Erik says about these issues. You can read those questions, I can't.
Every financial crisis in history have had some similarities and some differences. The 3 you mentioned here are quite different in a way. First of all, the Latin American crisis was at that stage where we thought that sovereigns could not default, and the banks, particularly American banks, lent obscene amount of money to those countries, and then we learned that they could default at the end of the day. The Asian crisis, on the other hand, were a more traditional one of a bubble, where just too much credit had been given for too long. And in Central Europe, I don't know if it's the right to box it with the same type of crisis. Ultimately, the Central European story is one of transition from a completely different economic system to a market economy, and that can never go smoothly. So it's a very different type of crisis. Well, there are lessons to be learned, always, but the important thing here is to remember that apart from those special ones we talked about before, crises are usually financial crises, and financial crises are always associated with housing and real estate. There's virtually no financial crisis that have not been triggered one way or the other by some version of a real estate bubble. So that's what you need to look for. You need to think about real estate and how it's financed, and then financing a little bit on the other side of other asset bubbles. But if you control or understand those, you have a very good way of predicting crises before they happen. I think the first thing a CEO would want to do when he thinks about the world is to appreciate that it's a globalized world, and it will become increasingly so. When he decides where you go and sell your products, where you produce your products, I would start by thinking about fundamentals. There's one thing we have learned through this crisis, which is that fundamental balance sheets matter an awful lot. These are the budget deficits, but it's most of all the current accounts. If you have a current account deficit, as we saw in Spain, for example, in that crisis, you know that something is wrong because somebody in that country are borrowing too much. In that case, it was not the government, it was the private sector, but the government then looks artificially strong. We have a little bit the same thing in Turkey today. Big current account deficit, decent government, but a rapidly increasing credit expansion in the private sector. So you want to keep that in mind to prevent being exposed to places which could unfold into a crisis. After that, you want to look at the political commitment to a smooth path, and you want to look at where the domestic demand develops, and that is more steady in the places where you have less of these fundamental imbalances, which will get you the great volatility that you want to avoid.
Okay, so that was Erik. I think he made a couple of interesting points in that, claiming that every crisis is in some form or other a housing crisis. Sounds a very strong claim to me, but I would actually like to go into another issue, which is Turkey. When we talked, you mentioned Turkey as well, Mr. Karls, as one country where you look particularly concerned to at the moment. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm particularly concerned regarding Turkey. I think regarding Turkey, what was just said, it's important to see that it's a big current account deficit there, and this is refinanced obviously by private investors, and it's refinanced in the majority around, if I'm right, around. So you have always in these circumstances in Turkey and in other countries, we have the same situation to prove that your business model as a country works and that there is a good future. And I think Turkey, for example, should have a good future and is definitely a very important and also great market, because it's a bridge between Europe and Asia, and if it's played the right way, I think there are a lot of opportunities, and we see actually that a lot of companies are going there due to different regions, cost diversification, market, etc., and also footstep then in a country which is big, which has obviously not the problems as we all have them regarding demographics. It's a country, I think, where the average age is around 20 years old, and I think Russia is an example, where it's completely the different case. But in all other countries, by the way, also in Poland, we have those demographic issues. But I think overall, as said earlier, you have to look at the specifics of the countries. Definitely, if you ask me about Turkey, I personally think there is there are a lot of opportunities for the country, for companies going there. Obviously, there's no free lunch. You have always to take some risks if you go to other countries. But what we also see, and let me speak a second about Germany. If you ask the bigger companies, if you ask those who have been successful over the last 10, 20 years, more or less all of them have started their business somehow in Germany, but then they have exported or they have imported, so they build up production facilities abroad, and that's clearly the way forward. And therefore, I think it's a great opportunity in this sort of framework here to discuss this. And Poland, for Germany, but also for us as a bank, is a great market with a huge perspective.
I just wonder, especially with Turkey, I see that it sort of like represents a case of an emerging market that was very much hyped within Europe, as for all those reasons you just mentioned: large market, young population, and now it seems to be tipping very rapidly, and we see a lot of tipping in emerging markets that went from the much hoped for BRICS countries, and now the IMF at the meeting in Washington, they just labeled the fragile five, which include South Africa and Turkey and I think Indonesia and Argentina probably. I don't know the others, but all of a sudden you have this talk about emerging markets losing a lot of their dynamism, losing a lot of their supposedly capability to pull the world economy along. And Turkey seems to be within Europe the one country where that might also take hold.
Well, as I said earlier, yeah, obviously you have risks in these countries and you have to look at the specifics of the countries. But overall, I think these are countries where you have got a lot of potential. Yeah? If I look at very much back to 1991, for example, here in Poland, yeah, there was a huge crisis. Current account deficit, etc. You all know this much better than probably me or us. Yeah? And today, it's said Poland is one of the major parts of Europe, of the EU. Yeah, everybody would be interested to get it into the Eurozone, more or less. Yeah, there are growth rates between 2, 3, 4% predicted over the next couple of years, and nobody thinks back to 1991, for example. Yeah, and I think. Yes, yeah, there are risks, yeah, you have to cope with them, but on the other hand, you have to look at markets, where are the opportunities, where are the chances. Obviously, CEE is a growth region. Turkey is, from my definition, part of CEE, and if you, again, look at the past Poland has gone, it's great, yes, you have to have the right infrastructure, you have to have the right politics there. Infrastructure is key, and also here, we learn that it's still some way to have the infrastructure like it's in other Central and Western European countries, but if you look at the investments from the EU done here in Poland, it's from 2014, so beginning next year, to 2020, the EU provides 73 billion euros for infrastructure and other projects in Poland. Yeah? That obviously shows the commitment, and that underlines a lot what's happening here.
Okay. I'd like to turn to the other world regions again. Fernando, how would you say, how important is or to explain us a little bit how the financial markets in Mexico work? How important is bank finance there? How important are capital markets? Because what we see here is that we see a slow development, especially in Poland, of capital markets developing further. So getting a little bit away from bank financing. How is that in your region?
Well, I believe most of the companies, well, more or less 85% of the companies use as their main finance vehicle suppliers in Latin American countries. So that's a very, very important factor to consider. And I'm not talking only working capital, but also when you're talking about perhaps some capital investments or some more long-term commitments. In terms of commercial bank, I would say that's the second largest, of course, main of financing. But if you're talking about debt issuance in Mexico, that's probably less than 2% of the companies that use that vehicle for financing.
Okay, is that developing? Because
it is
do we see some sophistication?
It is developing, of course. It is developing at a slow rate. That has a lot to do with the risk aversion of certain investors and let's say the maturity the stock exchange and other markets have in Mexico, and the same vehicles that they have to issue debt and to facilitate IPOs and stuff like that.
Okay. Has Tetra Pak, I mean, as I said, you're a big foreign investor. Have you changed the way you deal with your banks, or have you changed the way you finance either Tetra Pak as a whole or your subsidiary due or in result to the financial crisis?
Again, I believe it's not very fair to put in the context Tetra Pak. We use a lot our core banks, which are outside of Mexico anyway. Nevertheless, we have a strategy to balance our funding needs. So we use Mexican banks as well to face our let's say, Mexican currency obligations. But I believe what you should do as a responsible CFO is always to look at the opportunities you have for funding inside your country and outside your country in managing hedging strategies, derivatives, in order to ensure you're getting the best rates that you can in market.
Conchita, as in your function now, you look at a lot of different companies. Would you say they are now on a sounder financial footing than in the 90s? And if so, why?
Well, generally, I would say there is stability now. And because we have a more developed capital market, our stock exchange is very vibrant, and fundraising is no longer limited by accessing to bank loans, no more. The bond market is developed, so companies have options to raise funds through IPOs or through bond issuances, which were not there. I mean, it was not, that kind of capital allocation was not that efficient way back in the 80s or in the 90s. As a matter of fact, I can speak for the Philippines. We are now rated as a country as investment grade. And we're looking at 7% growth. And our foreign exchange translation to US dollar has stabilized. Okay. And banks claim that I'm not saying I am the one who claims, but international banks say that the Philippines is now on a sweet spot. And we are so happy about it.
So we hope that stays. I'm already getting signals about the time, which I'm aware of, but there's one last issue I want to address to Andrea, which is very relevant as well, is the matter of political risk. We also briefly talked about that. In many of those countries that you've worked at, how do you deal with this issue, and how do you find financing partners that deal with such an issue?
Well, we had to raise 700 million euros of finance in 2009-2010, which was quite a difficult period of time in the middle of the crisis or at the end of the crisis. And we managed to do it only because of the support of development banks. So our initial IFIs, financial investors are IFC, EBRD, and 3 other development banks from the region. So Black Sea Bank, Euro-Asian Bank, and so on. And they have syndicate, well, we have an A loan and a B loan, and under the B loan we have commercial bank, among others UniCredit, for example, no Commerzbank. And I am not aware about the exact arrangements between the 2 groups of banks, but I know that part of the political risk was taken by the IFIs, by the development banks. So the commercial banks have a different treatment under their contracts. So this was, by that time, probably the only way to find the money. Now we are talking to the market because we approach the second phase of development. And in the meantime, we are quite confident to find money also in Russia. So okay. Probably the involvement of development banks will be limited.
But we're certainly helpful at the initial phase.
Yes, provided that the oil price will not drop. So
let's see about that. Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Up here on the stage, if I may sum up very briefly, I think we've learned, even though we didn't have much time, but I think we've learned quite a bit. And if I sum up, I quote Conchita, don't fall in love with your pet projects. So if there's developments that are not favorable anymore to your business plan, just take them to your heart. Free trade is certainly painful in the beginning, but it's certainly helpful for the long run competitiveness of the country and of the company. And certainly as company leaders here, I think we need to embrace that even earlier than politicians probably do. Independent central banks were mentioned. I'm certainly supportive of that. And prepare for volatility. I think that is something, a lesson that we all have, and it's certainly not going away. And finally, bring on IAFEIs if you can, to mitigate some political risk potentially. These are some of the lessons I took from this discussion, and I'm very happy that you've all joined us from distant places. And now there's a first coffee break. We're already running a bit behind time because we had delays in the beginning because so many people were coming in. So maybe the coffee break will be a bit shorter. After that, we will have our first workshop sessions. Just listen to the gong and enjoy your first break. Thank you very much. Yeah.